Forgotten Voices of the Great War, 1917, from the Toll House in Lancaster. Captain Reginald Hayne, the 1st Battalion, the Honourable Artillery Company. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, company after company went forward. I could hear what they were going into. I waited all day with my company, lying in a sunken road, and believe me, you sweated blood. To see men sinking into the slime, dying in the slime, I think it absolutely finished me off. By the end of 1916, the British Expeditionary Force had expanded to 56 divisions, and for its planned offensives in 1917, it would have twice as many heavy guns as were assembled for the Somme. In the British sector, Haig launched a succession of minor attacks on the Somme to suggest to the Germans that he planned to resume major operations there once the weather improved. Local attacks began on January 10, 1917, and there was a 3-division assault on February 17, 1917. German strategy for 1917 was to remain on the defensive in both east and west. The German army abandoned many of the positions it had expended so much blood to defend and withdrew in early 1917 to pre-prepared defensive positions built the previous year. The Siegfried Stellung, known to the British as the Hindenburg Line. It began near the British front at Arras and ran through Saint-Quentin to La Faux, 6 miles northeast of Soissons. These lines incorporated every lesson learned in defensive warfare. Masses of wire protecting concrete strongpoints that formed a deep outpost line designed to absorb most of the weight of an attack forward of the main trenches. On April 9th, the British attacked at Arras. 14 divisions, including 4 Canadian divisions, supported by almost 3,000 guns and 48 tanks, tore into the defences to a depth of over 3 miles. The Canadians captured Vimy Ridge, and some 10,000 Germans were taken prisoner. Further attacks continued to gain ground, and the major German counterattack on May 6 was driven off with severe casualties. In the last week of May, the British 7th Corps broke into the first part of the Hindenburg Line in a sector held by depleted divisions stationed there for a rest. On April 16th, the new French Commander-in-Chief, General Nivelle, launched an offensive on the Chemin des Dames. He staked everything on a quick breakthrough, but failed to achieve it. The first large-scale attack by French tanks failed tragically. Most of the 82 Schneider tanks were destroyed. The new German defences proved effective. The sheer weight of the French attack, 52 French divisions against 38 German, and a greater preponderance of artillery, captured a few miles of ground and 20,000 prisoners in the first 4 days. Yet by the end of April, there was no sign of a breakthrough, and French losses were soaring. It was all very familiar, and to soldiers who had been promised victory after 3 years of suffering, it was too much. On April 29, the first mutinies began. Over the next few weeks, 68 of France's 112 divisions reported acts of collective indiscipline, essentially strikes. Soldiers refused to go back into the line or to make attacks. Pétain was appointed Chief of the General Staff. He restored order in due course, but it was plain that the only Allied army left in the field was that of the British Empire. Russia had disintegrated into revolution, and the United States, which had entered the war that summer, was at least a year away from fielding an army of European size. British attacks on the Somme in January-February 1917 were intended as no more than diversions. Haig's true objective was to break through to the Belgian coast and capture the ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend, used as bases by German coastal U-boats. One division with special tanks was prepared for an amphibious assault behind the German lines. The first stage of the plan was to attack the southern end of the ridge that dominated the Ypres salient, Messages Ridge. On May 21st, British artillery began to bombard the area, their fire increasing from June 2nd until 2,300 guns were involved. Mines had been dug under the German front line in a tunnelling operation of unprecedented ambition. They contained a total of about 450 tons of high explosive, and their detonation at 03:10 hours on June 7th reverberated across the front and was heard on the southern coast of England. The German front line vanished in an apocalyptic blast, and 7 British divisions, 1 Australian and 1 New Zealand, stormed the ridge. On July 31st, the offensive known to history as the Third Battle of Ypres, or more commonly Passchendaele, began. An artillery bombardment had been underway since July 18th, and air battles raged overhead as the British and French air forces sought to make the task of the German gunners impossible by destroying their observation balloons and shooting down their reconnaissance aircraft. On the night of July 31st, it began to rain. The rain that summer was the worst for 40 years, a near constant drizzle that filled the craters with muddy slime. The drainage system had been shattered by the weight of the bombardment, and even when it stopped raining, it remained overcast, with never enough sunshine to dry out the ground. Soldiers of both sides fought and died in a man-made swamp. In the brief periods of good weather, General Plummer's Second Army consistently managed to make modest advances, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy in what were known as bite and hold tactics. German counterattacks were smashed by British artillery. Haig continued the battle through October and into November, when the ruins of the village of Passchendaele came to form the immediate objective. He had reports on his desk suggesting German morale was about to crack, but his own army was sorely tried too. Both sides lost approximately 250,000 men at Ypres. As the Passchendaele offensive petered out, the British launched a surprise attack on the German lines near Cambrai. It was spearheaded by 380 tanks, the first mass tank attack in history. Its instant success was the product of new artillery methods pioneered by the British that did away with the need for lengthy bombardment that gave the enemy time to bring up his reserves. As the Battle of Cambrai was underway, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Russia sued for peace. One of the German divisions at Cambrai had recently been transferred from the Russian front. Over the winter of 1917-18, as the Russian troops laid down their arms, up to 40 more German divisions would be available to face the Allies on the Western Front. The American army would not be available in force until later in 1918. Germany had one last opportunity to win the war before the odds became insurmountable. Drinking dirty water. Corporal Clifford Lane, the 1st Battalion, the Hertfordshire Regiment. We were so thirsty that we actually drank water out of the shell holes. And God knows what a shell hole contains. It could hold anything, very often parts of a human body. But we were so thirsty we drank it cold without boiling it, because you couldn't get a fire very often. Mrs. Scott Hartley, Voluntary Aid Detachment. I was working as a VAD in a hospital in Bulstrode Street in West London. It was a big house taken over by the authorities. All the cases were shell-shocked, which meant they couldn't keep their hands or their heads still. I had to hold them gently behind their heads and feed them, and I also used to write their love letters. Many couldn't say what they wanted to say, or they were probably too shy to tell me, but I used to write for them and let them read them back. I used to say, "My dearest darling," and "forever yours." Lieutenant Ulrich Burke, 2nd Battalion, Devonshire Regiment. Our own expeditionary force, canteens, were far back behind the lines, but the Salvation Army and the church units were well up. They would find a place, then scrounge some wire netting and pieces of wood to make beds, and they'd soon have some tea to give you. One day there might be a Catholic padre on, and the next day a Protestant, a Jew, or a Presbyterian. They all took turns, and it was close to the line. You could always go into the canteen. They were marvellous, these people, especially the Salvation Army. Respirators had to be worn. Corporal Sidney Amat, London Rifle Brigade. We were always cold. In the winter we had thick woolen underwear and woolen shirts. Well, not woolen, but a similar material. And a cardigan or a pullover. Then we had our uniform. And on top of that we had our overcoats. During the winter of 1917, sheepskin coats were issued for the troops who were manning the front line. It was a sheepskin leather coat with the fleece still on it, and you put it on so the fleece was outward. You wore that over the top of your overcoat. If you were at the front line, you also had large gauntlets, otherwise you were issued with woolen gloves, and you had a woolen scarf which acted as a cover for your head after you'd taken your steel helmet off. You weren't allowed to go about unless you had a steel helmet on and your respirator fixed round your chest. These respirators came in 1916 with the advent of the Lewis gun, and you had to wear them all the time. Heinrich Betthard, German schoolboy. Black and white posters went up showing a man putting a hand to his lips and saying, "Be careful, don't talk too much. The enemy is listening to you." Nobody took them very seriously. Food was getting scarce, queues were getting longer, and soon going to a soup kitchen became one of the features of everyday life. Meat was scarce, butter was quite scarce, and we had the famous German turnips again and again because there were so few potatoes. The winter of 1917-18 was called the turnip winter. People were saying, "This war is lasting too long." The feeling was that Germany didn't have much chance of winning it because the conditions within the country were getting so very, very difficult. Comradeship was unbelievable. Lieutenant E.W. Stoner, the Royal Artillery. Comradeship among men was really most extraordinary and very difficult to describe. On one occasion, I was offered a safe job behind the lines if I would care to join brigade headquarters. It was very tempting, but I didn't want to go. There was something about the relationship with the men that one didn't want to break. One would have felt like a traitor to them, so I refused and stayed with the men. Somehow, you had a very strong sense of belonging to the men and to the job. Even when I got back to England on leave, it seemed to me that I really belonged at the front, that the leave was only an interlude. In a way, I was quite ready to get back. That was reinforced by the fact that my family didn't understand what was happening out there, and I didn't really want them to know all about it. So when I was talking to my parents or my sisters, I had to pretend that it was all very nice out there, and I had to describe a world that wasn't real at all. The real world was the one I had to get back to, and I felt no compunction about getting away when my leave was over. Private Shuttleworth, Army Service Corps. After being wounded, I was given the job of supervising a gang of Chinese labourers unloading ships. In the morning, they would parade, and goodness knows what they would wear. Ladies' blouses, black satin trousers, old coats, soldiers' tunics, anything they could steal. You had to treat them firmly, but kindly, as I believe one of the sergeants who got on the wrong side of them was later found with his throat cut. They did occasionally send out these blackhand notes to people. It was the custom to send any NCO back to England immediately if they received one of these notes, just for safety. Firing Squad. Private William Holmes, the 12th Battalion, the London Regiment. We were getting new recruits from London. One day we had these two youngsters, between 16 and 17 years of age, who had been with us for 2 weeks. When we had to go on the attack, the commanding officer came out and told us to get ready. We'd been laid in reserve to a regiment in front of us, and the previous morning the Jerrys had come over under a barrage of smoke and captured a whole battalion. These two youngsters, when they knew they were going to be doing this attack, were literally crying their eyes out. It was such a shock for them to go on an attack so soon. When we attacked, we lost sight of them, but they had actually cleared off and had been caught by the Red Caps about 4 miles from where the action was taking place. They were brought back and charged. On Sunday, the whole battalion was paraded. The two young men were brought in, their caps were taken off. Every insignia of their regiment was torn off to disgrace them as much as they could. The verdict was read out. It described how the two young men had deserted. By this action they were going to be shot the next day at dawn. As these two young men had been in my platoon, it was decided we would draw lots. Those that were drawn out, 4 of them, knew what they had to do at 8 o'clock the next morning. They felt as I would have done, terrified, almost sick. So the next morning, the 2 young men were brought out and blindfolded. The 4 men were given their bullets. Each pair were told to take one of the boys. One was to fire at the head, the other at the heart, so they would be killed instantly, as of course they were. The terrible thing was, the parents were never told. They were sent telegrams to say that their sons had been killed on active service. We lived with it all for weeks. But the point was this: every soldier directly he arrived in France was read out the war facts. Every man had come to fight. For the mere disobedience of an officer, you could be shot. So we knew that. We took punishment as a fact of life. Daily job, bury Germans who died. Private Shuttleworth, Army Service Corps. After I was wounded, I was given a job in a hospital. A lot of the patients were badly wounded German prisoners of war. If one of them died, they were placed in a rough box. We engaged a funeral director. He was just a driver who turned up with one horse, an old hearse, wearing a dirty old coat, with a black satin hat and a red scarf round his neck. As we went through the villages, the children shouted, "Allemand," and spat and threw stones. When we got to the cemetery, the ceremony was carried out as quickly as possible. The parson would read the service, soldiers lowered the box, then the last post, and home we came. The soldiers got rather fed up with doing this every day. The photograph shows British troops celebrating the capture of Monchy-le-Preux on April 11th, alongside the London omnibus that brought so many to the front in 1914, now reinforced with wooden panel. Mud 3 feet deep. Gunner Philip Sylvester, the Royal Artillery. We moved forward, but the conditions were terrible. Supplies and ammunition had to be brought on roads which were sometimes up to one's knees in slimy, yellowish brown mud. The horses were up to their bellies in mud. We'd put them on a picket line between the wagon wheels at night, but in the morning they had sunk in the mud. We had to shoot quite a number. Rations were so poor that we ate turnips. I went into the French dugouts, which had been there since 1914, and took biscuits that had been left there 3 years previously. They were all mouldy, but I ate one and it didn't do me any harm. We also had crusts of bread. We scraped black mud from them and ate them. You could make 2 biscuits last the whole day. As we went forward, the weather was very biting. They called the advance on Vimy Ridge and Arras the Easter egg, because it took place on Good Friday and Easter Monday. However, then we advanced through the barbed wire and found there were no roads. We used our horses like pack ponies. We went off to other parts of the front, then to a place near Arras to have a rest. We were fed double rations, as were the horses, to strengthen us as summer was coming. It was rather nice. And although we were quite a distance away from the scenes, when I was on picket duty, I heard the terrific roar of mines going off. Eventually we heard we were going to Passchendaele. The 51st Division had just come out, and I used to hear their bagpipes in the morning. I remember their buttons were polished. Occasionally you would see a plane turning round, spiralling, then coming down. Go and get souvenirs if it was nearby. Barbed wire stretched forever. Captain Reginald Hayne, 1st Battalion, Honourable Artillery Company. We were marched up from the Somme after the retreat of the Germans to Arras. Once we arrived there, they put us into a very strict training. We came out of the Somme to do training. During the middle of April, we pushed forward through a little village called Belleur. As near as we could, we dug in front of the Hindenburg line. Our orders were to get as near as we could to the German wire. Well, that was terrifying enough, because you could not see anything for this wire. There seemed to be acres and acres of it. On April 23rd, we were put into the attack of Gavrelle, which was part of the Hindenburg line. The photograph shows part of the barbed wire entanglement in front of the Hindenburg line. What happens when Aussie meets Brit? Lieutenant Charles Carrington, 5th Battalion, Warwickshire Regiment. The Australians suggested that as we were having a few days without any particular battle going on, it was surely the moment to have a test match. They found some unshelled ground within reach of their position and ours. We got some bats, balls, bails and stumps, and we played cricket. What the Germans could have thought was going on I cannot imagine, but it must have been reported by some German, because unfortunately the next morning, when the Australians were assembling on the pitch and we were on our way, they were heavily shelled. Some were killed and others wounded, and the ground was ruined. There was never going to be a return match. Sapper Road, First Australian Tunnelling Company, Australian engineers. The whole hillside rocked like a ship at sea. The noise from the artillery was deafening, and the thunder from our charges was enormous. The infantry dashed forward under a barrage and kept sending back thousands and thousands of prisoners. They came back through our dugouts and they were absolutely demoralised. We were all so happy, we didn't know what to do. Then, when we got a look at the craters, we saw there were lumps of blue clay, as big as small buildings lying about. Our Hill 60 crater was 100 yards across, from lip to lip, and 45 yards deep. Although a lot of stuff had naturally fallen back into the crater, we thought the war was over. Complete and utter patriot. Private Leonard Hayne, 1st Battalion, Honourable Artillery Company. It was an extremely severe winter, with 40 degrees of frost. It made things almost impossible. A shell bursting a quarter of a mile away could kill you. At this time, these shells just hit this solid ice and they scattered. We had our colonel killed during February. He was a wonderful chap, Ernest Boyle. He was 56 years old, which for a front-line soldier was very old. He'd been severely wounded at Hoog in 1915, but he was one of the few real fire eaters I ever met. There were a few. Most were unintelligent people. They hadn't got the imagination. But Ernest Boyle was a complete and utter patriot, and I remember he used to say, "My ambition is that my bones shall be buried in Flanders." And they were, poor chap. He got just a thing from a shell which landed, or at least 200 or 300 yards away, I suppose, which killed him. He was taken down the line to a little village called Hamel. He was such a very well-known chap because he had such a wonderful career, and several generals and people turned up for his funeral, but they couldn't dig a grave because the ground was completely solid. Deadly gas. Captain J.C. Hill, Special Gas Company, Royal Engineers. The German gas attacks were giving us great concern. I was sent as chemical advisor to the 8th Corps. One morning we found 1,000 casualties from a new type of gas shell. It was mustard gas. The men were blinded and couldn't see at all, and they were choking. Thousands had to leave the line. One of the shells hadn't exploded, so I nursed it on my knees all the way back to the research station. But it took our best chemist weeks to find out what this new substance was. It was a dreadful oily liquid called something sulfide that evaporated very slowly because it had such a faint smell. The troops tended to take no notice of it. Then when they finally did feel their eyes beginning to smart, it was too late. If they got it on the soles of their boots, it would go through and burn their feet. If they got some on their boots, then went into a hut or dugout and slept there, they would gas everyone else in it too. The top photo shows British cavalry advancing over newly captured ground in April. The bottom photograph shows part of a Lewis gun team waiting for the enemy on a canal bank near St Vincent. The Third Battle of Eden. Private Frederick Collins, Royal Tank Corps. Our objective was the Menin Road, and we were sailing along when all of a sudden we were hit. A shell had hit the track and broke me. We were finished. We were under terrible gunfire. The state of the ground was horrendous. There were great pits of water full of dead mules. The stench was indescribable. The tank commander got out and tried to find another tank. We stayed where we were. As it got towards dawn, the officer, Lieutenant Thompson, said, "Well, chaps, we'll have to make a run for it. If they catch us here when it's light, we're done." We ran out two at a time. We were very, very lucky not to be hit. In a shell hole, we found two dead men. I knew them, an officer and his driver. The officer's brains had been blown out. There was also an old priest there, dressed in a black cloak and a round hat, who was giving them the last rites. Corporal Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. We went over the top. We didn't have anybody firing at us, not for 15 minutes or so. Eventually we came under long-distance machine gun fire. The man on my right was hit in the heart. That was just the look of war. We got to a stream called Steenbeck and were told to lie down prone. I felt an object fall at my side. It was a tin of Woodbines. I looked again and there was a padre. I'd never seen a padre taking part in an attack, but he was worthy of the highest praise. I saw a pillbox 200 yards away, and as we got close, we came under very heavy machine gun fire, and practically the whole of our platoon was wiped out. Most of them were hit in the heart. The one that hit me caught me in the shoulder. Battle of Menin Road Ridge. Lieutenant Douglas Wimberley, 232nd Machine Gun Company, Machine Gun Corps. I spent the night before the battle in a concrete pillbox, Ferdinand Farm. It had very thick concrete walls, but it was a curious sort of place to have a headquarters. It had been built by the Germans. Inside it was only about 5 foot high, and at the bottom was 2 feet of water. This water was horrendous, full of refuse, old tins, and even excretion. The Boche had made a concrete shelf 2 foot above ground level. On this shelf were 4 officers and 6 other ranks who spent the night there. There wasn't room to lie down. We more or less crouched there. Outside the pillbox was an enormous shell hole full of water. The only way out was over a 10-inch plank. Inside the shell hole was the dead body of a Boche who had been there a very long time and floated or sank on alternate days according to the atmosphere. The photograph shows men of the Durham Light Infantry before the Menin Road Ridge battle on September 20th, 1917. Wounded Germans get treatment. Private Harry Patch, Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. The shelling was back. You could hear the big shells coming. Although if you could hear them, that was all right. They'd gone over. You never heard the whiz bangs coming. They were just there. And you never heard the shell or the bullet that hit you. Of course, whiz bangs were shrapnel, and that was worse than a bullet. The bullet wound was clean. Shrapnel would tear you to pieces. It was a whiz bang that killed my 3 friends and wounded me. It was just bad luck. They had those 4 magazines over their shoulders, fully loaded. That was why they all got blown to pieces. Great friends gone in an instant. The photo shows a dressing station with hundreds of wounded German prisoners from the Battle of Menin Road Ridge. kits, kilts and naked knees. Lieutenant Hartwig Pohlman, 36th Prussian Division. On September 20th, the great attack of the Highland Division met our own regiment. The firing went on for several hours, even after the Highlanders had stormed our front line and were trying to advance through all these shell holes. The firing was so heavy, I didn't notice the single shells. We advanced and drove the Highlanders back a bit, but we couldn't reach the front line where our 3rd Battalion had been vanquished. They were all gone. Many were dead, some taken prisoner. We didn't see any of them again. We happened to catch some of the Highlanders, and it was a funny sight for us to see soldiers with kilts and naked knees. The photograph shows a padre giving comfort to a wounded soldier from the Battle of Menin Road Ridge. We saw green fields. Captain W. Bunning, 24th Australian Battalion. The attack on Broadsend happened on the morning of October 4th, 1917. We were in the leading wave for the attack on the ridge and beyond. We moved into position at midnight, 0 hour. Going over the top was 6 a.m. Just before 5:30 a.m. it rained a little. Not uncomfortable. We waited till 6 o'clock. The German barrage lifted and ours came down. To our surprise, in the valley we could see Germans running about in our barrage. They were soon devastated by our barrage. We went on and took what was called the red line below the top of Broadsend Ridge. There we dug in and consolidated. Then some smoke shells came over, which indicated that the barrage was about to creep forward. The 24th went through onto their objective, which was the blue line. Casualties in my company were not really heavy, not as heavy as one might have expected from the early shelling. We moved forward carefully, checking to see the field of fire was suitable for the men. What was really surprising was to look across and see before you the green fields of Belgium, to see actual trees and grass. Of course, the fields had not been churned up a good deal by barrage shells, but as far as we were concerned, it was open country. But then to look back to where we'd come from, Ypres, there was total devastation. And then at dawn, we could see why our own gunners had had such a gruesome time. You could see the flashes of all the guns firing right from Broadsend to the Menin Gate. Green Plains of Belgium. Private S.C. Lang. My battalion went into the line in the middle of the night. It was raining and misty everywhere. We had to travel on duck-borne tracks. Going in, the shells were landing amongst us. One man was killed in front of me. I was then blown off the tracks and had to be held back on, or I'd have sunk into the mud and slime. We lay down in shell holes, waiting for the attack, due at 6 o'clock. When at 5:30 a sudden and tremendous barrage came from the Germans. But suddenly, as I lay in my shell hole, I had a premonition. I became utterly convinced that nothing could hurt me. I almost went to sleep. Then at 6 o'clock, a magnificent sound started up. It was the swee, swee, swee of our own barrage. It seemed to stop the German barrage immediately. We got up, sticky with mud, and somehow the whole battalion had not been wiped out. We went up the hill to Broadsend Ridge in perfectly good order. By that time there didn't seem to be many Huns about at all. We went over the top, and when we got there we saw the whole of the green plains of Belgium spread out before us. We could have gone on and on. There was nothing to stop us except a sea of mud through which no gun could possibly be dragged. If we'd gone on, we'd have been annihilated by the German gunfire, so we had to stop. broken in spirit and mind. Bombardier J.W. Palmer, the 26th Brigade Royal Field Artillery. It was mud everywhere. Mud in the trenches, mud in front of the trenches, mud behind the trenches. Every shell hole was a sea of oozing mud. I suppose there's a limit to everything, but the mud of Passchendaele, to see men sinking into the slime, dying in the slime, I think it absolutely finished me off. I knew for 3 months before I was wounded that I was going to get it. The only thing was, I thought I was going to get killed every time I went out to mend the wire. I think I was the biggest coward on God's earth. Nobody knew where the wire would go, but we knew that it had to be mended. The infantryman's lives depended on those wires working. It didn't matter whether or not we had any sleep. We just had to keep those wires going. There were many days when I simply don't know what happened because I was so damn tired. The fatigue in that mud was something terrible. You reached a point where there was no beyond. You just couldn't go any further. And the night I reached my lowest ebb, I'd been out on the wire for 24 hours. It was very, very difficult to mend a telephone wire in this mud. You'd find one end and then you'd try and trudge through the mud to find the other end. But as you got one foot out, the other one would sink down again. It was somewhere near midnight. I crouched down in one of the dirty shell holes. I began to think of those poor devils who'd been punished for self-inflicted wounds. Some had even been shot. I began to wonder if I could get out of it. I sat there and kept thinking. Then in the distance, I heard the rattle of a harness. I knew there were ammunition wagons coming up and thought, well, here's a way out. When they get level with me, I'll ease out and put my leg under the wheel and plead it was an accident. I waited as the sound got nearer and nearer. I saw the leading horses' heads in front of me. I thought, this is it. I began to ease out, but you know, I never had the guts to do it. I just couldn't do it. I think I was broken in spirit and mind. Passchendaele was horrendous. Gunner Sidney White, Royal Artillery. The only way up from Ypres was by a plant road 15 to 20 feet wide. All munitions had to travel a considerable distance up this plant road, and the mud was so deep that on one occasion, with drag ropes on the wheel and something like 100 men on the ropes, it was still impossible to pull the guns out of the mud. The mud and the conditions were absolutely indescribable. You saw fellows coming down from the trenches, badly wounded, covered from head to foot in blood, and perhaps an arm missing. You saw one of the fellows drop off the duck boards and literally die from exhaustion and loss of blood, or sink into the slime. Horrible it was. A panoramic view of Passchendaele showing the mud and desolation. Dozens of rats. Gunner Leonard Unsworth, 124th Heavy Battery Royal Garrison Artillery. The rats used to pinch your rations at night. They'd gnaw through anything you put them in, unless it was a metal container. But the gas attack finished them. In the morning, there were dozens and dozens of these rats crawling about on their bellies. We just stubbed our toe between them and sent them into the moat. Yet there were 2 swans which lived on the moat, and they lived on the ramparts, apparently unharmed. Private Rayner Taylor, Welsh Regiment. The battalion halted along the roadside for the usual 10 minutes. Suddenly we were called upon to stand up because the King was coming along this road, and we were expected to cheer him. This cavalcade came along, the King in his car, and the officers did cheer, but I have no recollection of any of the men cheering. after a period in the front line, you weren't in the mood to cheer anybody. Lieutenant Ulrich Burke, 2nd Battalion, Devonshire Regiment. The men were hardened, but the life was terrible. Another extra chore was spreading lime because excretia was being chucked out. A further great problem was trench fever and trench foot, a very high temperature. It was probably trench fever. It wasn't dysentery exactly, but it was constant diarrhoea, leaving him weak and listless. Trench foot was owing to the mud soaking through your boots. In many cases, your toes nearly rotted off. We lost more men that way than we did from any wounds or anything. Consolation was the Germans were suffering the same as us. Sergeant Major Richard Tobin, Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. There was no chance of being wounded or getting a blighted one at Passchendaele. You got through or died, because if you were wounded and slipped off the duck boards, you just sank in the mud. There were hundreds and hundreds of yards zigzagging about. At each side was a sea of mud. If you stumbled, you were going up to the waist. Every pool was full of decomposed bodies of humans and mules. There was no front line to speak of, just a series of posts scraped in the mud, a machine gun crew here, a few riflemen there. Further on, a Lewis gun crew. In some cases, the battle depth of your battalion was 1,000 yards of these posts bogged down. You couldn't get food or ammunition to any of them in daylight because the Germans were shelling the whole time. And if you were on the duck boards, you couldn't run anywhere. The men found the relief was hopeless. The battalion came from ordinary trenches, but the men struggled back in 2s and 3s, some a day late. I've seen men going out covered in mud. They just scraped it away from their eyes. They carried in their hands what looked like a muddy bough of a tree, but it was their Lewis gun. Their only thought was that the Germans were in as bad a position as we were. In fact, there was one place where a little party of men was trying to make their hole more comfortable by scooping it out, and some 100 yards away the Germans were doing exactly the same, but both, in their miseries, didn't take any damn notice of each other. Almost dead. Fusilier Joseph Pickard, 5th Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers. I remember being in a sort of clearing station. When I came round, it was dark, and I was lying on a stretcher. I didn't know what was the matter with me. It turned out there was a blanket over the top of me, and I'd been left for dead. My old lady later got the number of my grave and the King and Queen's sympathy, but fortunately I didn't know at the time. I got rid of this blanket and then I saw a light near where I was, so I shouted down an orderly, and 2 of them eventually came down and had a look at me. They wouldn't give me a drink, of course, but they picked up the stretcher and put it straight on a hospital tray. The photo shows guardsmen bringing in a wounded soldier at Passchendaele. Mud claims another young life. Sergeant Cyril Lee. I remember trying to help a lad in his copse about 100 yards from our jumping off trench. There was no hope of getting to him. He was struggling in the middle of this huge sea of mud. Then I saw a small sapling and we tried to bend it over to him. But we were seasoned soldiers by then. But the look on the lad's face was really pathetic. He was only a mere boy. It pricked my conscience. I felt I should try and do something more for him. But I couldn't do a thing. And I bent it a little more, I would have gone in with it, as so many had. It was hopeless. Photographs show soldiers fixing scaling ladders before a battle. Telephone wire was essential. Lieutenant E.W. Stoneham, Royal Artillery. One day when we were less active in the battery, another officer and myself went out across the battlefield to reconnoitre, to see if we could find an alternative position should we have to take one up. We'd walked about for some hours and were getting rather tired, so we decided to rest. There were no dugouts to shelter in, but we did find, as usual, a huge shell crater. So we got into this crater and sat down. Presently, my fellow officer, who happened to be something of a scholar, started reciting Shelley's Skylark, and I found myself frantically yelling out, "Stop!" I realised if he'd gone on, I don't know what would have happened to my nerve. I might have lost control. The photograph shows men carrying reels of telephone wire on precarious duck boards. Tanks weren't perfect. Lieutenant Miles Rink, 2nd Guards Dragoons, German Army. When the first tanks passed the first line, we thought we would be compelled to retreat towards Berlin. I remember one tank by the name of Hyena, which advanced very far and suddenly stopped about 1,000 yards from my little dugout. Some of the boys soon discovered they could stop the tanks by throwing a hand grenade into the manhole on the top. Once this was known, the boys realised that there was a blind spot, that the machine guns couldn't reach every point around the tank, and these points were very important in the defence. I was shocked and felt very sorry for those fellows in the tanks, because there was no escape for them. Once a man was on top of the tank, it was doomed to failure, and the poor fellows were not able to escape. The fuel would start to burn, and after about 2 hours we saw only burning tanks in front and behind us. Anyhow, the attack came to a standstill, and we waited for several regiments of cavalry to sweep up and drive us towards Berlin. But much to our surprise, it didn't happen. When new troops were pulled together near this break-in of the British tanks, the situation settled down. We formed anew, and afterwards we could clearly see the spot where the British tanks had driven into the German lines. Then after a few days we made a counter-attack. It didn't succeed on the first or second day, but on the third day we were finally successful. The Battle of Cambrai. Captain Douglas Wimberley, 232nd Machine Gun Company, Machine Gun Corps. The wire at Cambrai was about 4 foot high and 50 yards wide, but the tanks that had gone in front of us had ploughed through it like a ship in the sea, and we had no difficulty at all in following their tracks. We also got over the Hindenburg front line. That was an enormous trench, 8 feet deep and 15 feet wide, but again we were able to get over quite easily. Getting our mules over wasn't so easy, but luckily there were quite a lot of Germans there who were looking for someone to surrender to. When it became light, it was a wonderful sight. You could see the lines of tanks going down the slope towards the Grand Ravine, and the lines of jocks slowly moving along behind them. There were many Germans in every direction. The nearest ones were wanting to surrender, and the others were trying to escape the tanks. They left their trenches and dugouts, probably rightly, because had they stayed, they'd have got Mills bombs from the jocks. They were a very poor type of German. They were small, unshaven and dirty, and quite a lot were wearing spectacles, rather like the cartoons of the time of what the Germans were supposed to look like. Later on, we got into position and began shooting overhead fire over the lines of the advancing Jocks. The extraordinary thing was that for about 3 minutes I had to stop firing altogether, as a great number of Boche came straight towards our machine guns with their hands up, and it would have been an absolute sheer massacre to have killed them all. Corporal Jack Dillon, 2nd Battalion Tank Corps. The location of the Battle of Cambrai was kept so secret that even my colonel didn't know about it. In fact, I was told before he was, because I was company reconnaissance officer. It was my job to reconnoitre the route up to the front. I thought that Cambrai was a splendid choice because it hadn't been fought over much, and the going was very good. One couldn't ask for better conditions. On the night of November 20th, we started moving tanks up to the starting position. The tanks were driven by relief drivers and relief crews to enable the crews to be fresh for the battle. The tanks were terribly noisy when you were inside one, but outside, on soft ground, they weren't too bad. So we got to our starting position about 150 yards behind our front line, and the tanks were lined up, so when the whistle blew that morning, they only had to drive forward. At 0 hour, the tanks moved forward, and there was a creeping barrage that wouldn't damage the ground at all. Our artillery had pinpointed the German artillery to stop them firing at the tanks. Then, out of the blue, came a bullet that split my thumb and knocked my walking stick miles out of my hand. But the front opened up like a pat of butter. The trenches of the Hindenburg line were our main objective. To cross that line with tanks was quite impossible, as it was enormously wide and deep, but the ingenuity of our headquarters staff produced the answer. Enormous bundles of fascines, in other words, brushwood, were provided. They were about 5 feet in diameter. They weighed about 1.5 tons on the nose of the tank. As the tank came to a trench, this bundle was released, fell into the bottom of the trench, and this enabled the tank to nose down, rest on it, and crawl up the other side. The uncrossable Hindenburg line was crossed. Corporal Jack Dillon, 2nd Battalion Tank Corps. The Germans were very annoyed with us for this ungentlemanly trick. Many of them thought these tanks with peculiar things on their noses were some new infernal machines. However, it worked, and for the first time we had some form of tactical manoeuvre, because there were plenty of tanks on the ground. There were about 350 tanks, so the idea was to select a trench, and at point X the leading tank would cross and then move on up to the next trench. The next 2 tanks would cross over the same fascine and turn right or left, clearing the trenches on either side. The last tank would follow along and overtake the first one, so that the process could be repeated at the next line of trenches. The tank would stop halfway across the trench and fire a few rounds of 6-pounder down it, and that cleared it all right. The infantry would then come up and take over. As regards crossing the barbed wire, this was a miracle to see. I've never seen such a depth of barbed wire. It was 10 yards deep, 4 foot high, and so dense you could barely poke a broom handle through it. It could never be destroyed by artillery fire in a month of Sundays, but the tanks went through it, and I personally followed the tracks and walked straight through as if it had been on a carpet. The tanks cleared the wire for the crossing of large numbers of soldiers by driving into it 2 abreast, dropping in steel anchors, then turning away from each other and going down the length of the wire, pulling the anchors after them. The result was to drag the enormous barbed wire fences into balls of wire about 20 foot high, and when they cleared the ground, it was as clean as a whistle. There wasn't a scrap of anything left, not even weeds. Corporal Jack Dillon, 2nd Battalion Tank Corps. We got through all 4 German lines without any serious opposition. The tanks reached their objective quickly, and when I caught up with them, I found the crews sitting down drinking mugs of tea. The infantry were sculling about, wondering at having got through so easily. It was a complete breakthrough. If the cavalry corps had been on the spot to carry on the attack, as was intended, it could have been a major British victory. We could have pushed through to the other side of Cambrai, and there would have been a complete readjustment of the German line. But the cavalry weren't produced until hours too late, and then there weren't enough troops on the ground. It was obvious by about 10 o'clock that there had been 3 or 4 hours for the Germans to reorganise. By that time the tanks had been withdrawn, covered by the infantry. I had no further reason to be there, so I found a spare ammunition mule, got on its back, and got a lift back to the casualty clearance station, where I got my thumb dressed. It was a nasty mess, but it healed marvellously, and I got full use of it back. Entering the Grand Ravine. Captain Horace Burke's Royal Tank Corps. We had rough compasses in the tanks and set course for the enemy line. It was dead silent until we got to the enemy wire, which was 0 hour for guns, and that again was a first-class show. Crystal Palace had nothing on it. There was no answer from the Germans at all. It was the first times in our life we saw the Hun being blown up all over the place, and the troops were frightfully pleased. But then we got into this belt of wire, 7 foot high, over 120 yards deep in places. We all emerged on the other side into the deep valley known as the Grand Ravine. The photo is of Australian troops of the 3rd Division the day before the 3rd Battle of Ypres. Horrors of a shell hole. Private S.T. Sherwood. As I slipped to the bottom of the shell hole, I took my torch out, flashed it around, and to my horror, found I had a German companion. That was where the terrific stink came from. I knew that without help, it was impossible to get out, so I shouted, screamed, to make someone hear me. I wasn't one to panic, so I struggled as hard as I could to climb up the sides. Every time I got within a yard of the top, I would slide back to the bottom. I was swearing with all the exertion. Then as I lay back in the trench, I remembered my old pipe and smoked pipe after pipe, but I was sinking further and further into the mire. The water was above my waist. Then I had either dozed off or became unconscious, because when I woke, the bottom of my body was completely paralysed by the coldness of the water, which I could feel creeping further up. During this period, the Germans began shelling the area. It kept me awake and alive. I was still sinking further into the mire. I filled my pipe again, and then put my hand into my tunic pocket for the matches, and found they were wet through. It was then I began to despair. I thought I'd sooner be killed with a shell or a bullet than die in a bloody filthy shell hole. I thought I was dreaming. I could hear footsteps somewhere. Feebly I tried to shout, until I heard a voice say, "Where are you?" I shouted back, "I'm here, in a shell hole." The footsteps went round again for a few minutes, then looking up, I saw a head appear over the top. He said, "Oh my God, hang on, chum." I remembered no more until I found myself in hospital, between clean white sheets. They were heaven. Another clean bed with white sheets. Corporal J. W. Palmer, Royal Artillery. I suddenly realised I wasn't dead, that I was still alive. I realised that if these wounds didn't prove fatal, I should get back to my parents, to my sister, to the girl I was going to marry, the girl that had sent me a letter practically every day from the beginning of the war. I was taken to a dressing station and given morphine, and then I must have had that sleep that I so badly needed, for I didn't recollect any more until I found myself in a clean bed with white sheets, and I could hear the lovely, wonderful voices of the nurses with their English, Scotch and Irish accents, and then I think I completely broke down in tears. For the next thing, the padre was sitting beside my bedside, trying to comfort me. He said I'd had an operation, and then told me that he had some relatives out in the war who had been fighting since 1914. And by God's grace, they haven't had a scratch. He said, they've been lucky, haven't they? I thought to myself, lucky, who were devils. Prince of Wales. Sub-Lieutenant William Benham, Hawke Battalion, Royal Naval Division. When I got to France, there was snow all over the Western Front. There had been a severe frost, and there were lots of frozen corpses that couldn't be moved or buried. Before I got there, the Germans had made an early dawn attack across the snow, wearing white sheets and using whitened rifles. They'd managed to drive back the last battalion with great casualties because they hadn't been seen, and we still had several bodies lying there frozen. When at last the frost broke, we were able to get the bodies down, and one of them was Sub-Lieutenant Alan Campbell, the son of Mrs. Patrick Campbell, the actress. I had the unenviable job of being in charge of the burial party. After the burials, I turned to walk the 5 miles back to the line. It was a pouring wet afternoon, with squally sleet going down our necks, and the roads full of puddles and shellholes. My orderly, Adawa Scott, was with me, and presently we heard the sound of a car coming along. My orderly commented, "Some ruddy staff waller, sir." I said, "Yes, I expect so." But instead of swishing past us in a shower of mud and water, the car stopped, and a cheerful young voice said, "Would you chaps like a lift?" We were being offered a lift by the Prince of Wales, who was on one of his tours of the front line. My orderly sat behind his driver, while he and I sat in the back with his equerry. We had a long talk, and I found him more than interesting. After 3 or 4 miles, his way was different from mine, so he put us down and we trudged back to the trenches. Shrapnel in the kneecap. Gunner William Towells, the Royal Field Artillery. I was one of 15 drivers, taking 30 horses to try and get ammunition through to our battery's guns. Each driver had 2 horses, and you had a pack for each horse, with 8 shells in it. So I was following the sergeant when a shell dropped right next to us, and that was it. I remember going up in the air and landing on the floor. I wasn't in pain, but shrapnel had gone into my kneecap. 2 men from RAMC came over, and one of them tipped a bottle of iodine into the hole in my knee. The pain was terrific. They bandaged it and put me on a stretcher. All around was barren land. After going a little way, they put the stretcher down. They went to a trapdoor, lifted it up, put the stretcher on a slide and lowered it down. There was a proper hospital underneath. It had been a German hospital. They took me to the theatre, and the sister pressed a white mask over my face. The anaesthetic hit me, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up on a train. was in a carriage on a stretcher fixed on a wall, and when I looked round, Sergeant Emsley was next to me. He'd been wounded in the leg as well. They took us to a hospital at Etaples and then put me in a bed and fitted me with a Thomas splint, a round wooden ring with iron bars and a footrest. The pain from my knee was getting terrible, so when I saw an officer coming up with his arm around two sisters and laughing, I said, "Excuse me, sir, could you have a look at my knee? The pain is driving me crazy." He came over and he stank of whiskey. When the nurses took the bandages off, he said, "Oh, there's fluid above the knee. We'll tap that tonight." Gunner Willing Towers, Royal Field Artillery. But when I woke up in the early hours of the morning, I thought, "Oh my God, my leg's gone." They'd guillotined it off without saying a word. There had been no hint at all that I was going to lose my leg. They hadn't even looked at it until I asked the doctor. That day I prayed to die. All I could think of were the men who stood begging on street corners with a crutch and a tin can. And I was a footballer, and that was finished. It was terrible. Late in the afternoon, a nurse came and took the blanket off and started tearing the gauze off. I called her every name I could think of. I was in agony. After that, they put me on a boat and I was taken to Stockport General Hospital. The civilian doctor, Mr. Fenwick, came to look at me. When he took the bandages off, the smell was terrible. The flesh had receded, 2 inches of bone stuck out, and it had gone black. He said, "Send a telegram for his mother and father to come right away." He thought I was going to die. He told the sister to get a bowl of sterilised water with peroxide in it, and that my leg had to be syringed with this solution every 4 hours. Then it started to get better. The wound became beautifully clean red flesh. Mr. Fenwick said, "We're going to win, Willie." My parents came and my future wife, whom I'd met when I was home on leave. I think it was her that pulled me through, and Mr. Fenwick was an angel. He arranged for a friend of his, a surgeon who specialised in amputation, to re-amputate the leg and make a proper stump. He did it, and it was perfect. Everybody who said it, "What a beautiful job."